Well, welcome back from spring break, quite a long spring break and quite a difficult situation. I'm going to try to help you out a little bit and see if I can have these videos for you posted on YouTube. Not sure how many I'm going to do, but I wanted to finish off the lectures that we were doing on evidence for evolution that will wrap up the lecture exam 3 information. Where we left off was taking a look at evidence for evolution from biogeography. And the part that we were on was invasive species. Now, what invasive species show us is that many species can live, can prosper, can do very well. They can actually cause problems. They can do so very well, just like the kudzu vine that we were looking at, just like the cane toads that we were looking at before break. And here we were looking at there we go, the brown tree snake. This is where we left off. Taking a look at the brown tree snake that managed to make its way to the island country of Guam. And so I remember pointing out to you where Guam is located. Here on a map, we're going to kind of blow this up and show you the location of Guam. So there's Guam on a map and some of the detail. Again, the reason that we care a lot more about Guam in the United States is because Guam is a U.S. territory. So there's federal money available, and that's some of the research that I did. Well, the brown tree snakes got introduced into Guam about World War II, and they did unbelievably well, devastatingly well. And that's what we want to talk about. Where do we normally find brown tree snakes? This is stuff, by the way, that we covered before break. We find them, as you can see on the map, in New Guinea and on the northern coastline of Australia. And then they made their way to Guam. And once they made their way to Guam, they did really, really well. So that's the question. Why weren't there brown tree snakes there already? Well, using the hypothesis of evolution, the hypothesis is that species originate, evolve in some parts of the world, and then they spread from there as they can. And we were keeping in mind that that's what they can do over vast lengths of time. So perhaps they can't spread now, but there might be conditions such as lower ocean levels that might permit organisms to move in the future. Okay? So the question is it that we only find species in certain places because they cannot live elsewhere? Well, that's certainly not the case with the brown tree snake. So we're going to look at some more examples of invasive species. And that's the geese, if you hear behind me, that are landing on my pond. All right, brown tree snakes. Here's what they look like. We had already talked about them. They're a rather thin snake. I find them to be pretty, well, they made the case. Here comes the geese again. Isn't that fun? So this is what we get, by the way, not highly polished lectures, but me sitting at my desk on a Saturday and hearing the lovely geese land behind us. Okay, the brown tree snake's very thin. I had made the case that I actually think that you could say they're aggressive. They really seem to hold their ground and are not at all very friendly. You might remember that I told you that this is a research project that I worked on in which in 1990 I was supported by federal money to try to figure out why it was that when brown tree snakes were making their way into homes and biting infants pretty much under the age of 1, why were those children really, really bothered with the suppression of respiration? And so you can see, and I think you can see the cursor now on the screen, what we did was describe this gland, the Duvernois gland on the side of the head, that was, in our description, shown not to be a venom gland, but instead to be a simple digestive enzyme gland. And we think that part of the response to the children were these digestive enzymes. I'm now able to tell you something that I knew, but I couldn't tell you because it wasn't something that I could say out loud. But I was talking to you about other research looking at the reproductive biology of brown tree snakes. And I ended with this blue text here about Dr. Wisniewski. I think her last name's Call. Well, in any case, Sam, that's her first name, Sam Wisniewski, was a Blackburn student here about 15 years ago. And very, very good student, very talented. And it says here that she's assistant professor at Texas Tech. Well, Dr. Wisniewski is one of 2 finalists for our ecology position at Blackburn College. And because we've now reached the point that we're having open interviews, I can now tell you that she's one of 2 people that might be our ecologist next year. So how much fun is that? One of the other stories that I tell, and we don't have a lot of time to talk it through, is the story of Dr. Julie Savage and her work in the 1980s, earning her PhD here, also locally, at the University of Illinois. And you can see she's at Colorado State right now. Well, Dr. Savage went to Guam to try to figure out what was happening to the birds. And all of her mentors told her all about looking for disease, parasitic diseases, who knows, a viral infection. Goodness gracious, at our horrible time in the pandemic, yes, you can have viral infections spreading within birds and killing them off in the same devastating ways that people are dying today from COVID. This is what Dr. Savage worked out. She got there looking for parasites and something else, and lo and behold discovered that the devastation of the birds on Guam was largely due to a snake, not to disease. This is not the best of all images here on food webs, but take a look at sort of the simplest food webs that were going on 1945, 1965, 1995. Look at 1965 and look at how much the brown tree snake was able to come in and attack all these different levels of the food web, reducing it down now pretty much to just rats, doves, some geckos, and skinks. Here's the interesting part to me, at least at the beginning of the story. Why did I get federal funding to come in and study brown tree snakes in 1990? Well, in 1990, there were so many power outages, electrical outages in Guam. You can see here the number due to brown tree snakes, that they were trying to figure out what's going on with these snakes, and the federal government was throwing a lot of money at the situation. In any case, I told you about the medical interest. Here's then the saddest part. Here are the species of birds that have been devastated. Okay? Guam flycatcher doesn't exist anymore. It's completely extinct. The bridled white eye is no longer found on Guam, so it's said to be extirpated. Just as well, the white-throated ground dove, also the word is extirpated. That means they're no longer found in a region, and so they're no longer found on Guam. Some of what we're trying to do with these birds that are still remaining is put them on some offshore islands of similar ecology so that they can be kind of refuges for these birds. And that was what I was discussing if you were at my New Zealand talk about what's being done in New Zealand. Likewise, finding offshore islands where the invasive species haven't made it. Here you can see the reed warbler, no longer on Guam, extirpated as well. Just as well, you can see that we aren't finding the fruit dove, and this subspecies is completely gone. My wife just reminded me that Julie Savage had written a book. I usually bring it in and show you guys, but this is a little trimmed back on how lecture is. I have in my office the book that Julie Savage wrote called And No Birds Sing, the story of an ecological disaster. And so you can see all kinds of birds that were lost on Guam due to this incredible invasive event. In fact, one of the stories was that an ornithologist on Guam invited an ornithologist from the continental United States to just come to Guam. And it wasn't clear why the person was inviting their colleague. And their colleague arrives then from the States. They make their way to the forested environment, and the ornithologist from Guam says, now just let's be quiet and listen. And in fact, they couldn't hear all these species singing anymore. Here, interestingly, are two species that were fighting to keep. The Micronesian kingfisher is quite a story, and the Guam rail would have had no chance as well. So what the brown tree snakes are doing is they're going up in the trees and they're finding finding the eggs, and when they look at the eggs, they wait until they're hatching. I don't think they're eating the eggs intact. And so we think, and we know now, that they're actually smelling the blood that's associated with birth or hatching. And so that's when they go up to these nests then and feed on the young babies. So the Guam rail and the Micronesian kingfisher are still birds that you can see in zoos, and through captive breeding, we hope we have a chance. Well, that's the story of the brown tree snake. Again, clearly showing that an organism could live in another place, but doesn't. We looked at zebra mussels in the zoology class. Here they were introduced into the Great Lakes about 40 years ago, and they've just proliferated. This is a beach that's just full of the shells, so you can imagine that impacts people that would like to enjoy the beach. I had some of the zebra mussels that I collected along the Great Lake. The zebra mussels grow on all sorts of things. They clog up systems, and they cost hundreds of millions of dollars a year in damage. We talked about how they were introduced in ballast water, so I'm not going to go through all that story again. Here's the spread that you can see from the introduction in the 80s all the way through about the year 2000. Now through 2017, you can see the distribution and notice that there's now populations in the western United States. It's no longer just the Mississippi waterways, but it's all the way across the mountains. And we think that this is because people put their boats in to go fishing in the Midwest, take them out, drive them across the mountains, and then put their boat in the west, and they've transferred in their boats the zebra mussel larvae or the really small zebra mussels. So it just spreads. So California is really working on it, but once an invasive species has made it into a region, it is nearly impossible to get rid of them. That's why I was really interested in what they were doing, at least on some small islands in New Zealand where they were able to come in and very selectively get rid of them. But they were doing it through some very harsh methods, massive poisoning of mammals. And that around here would have much greater consequences to things that eat the dead mammals, such as birds of prey. This is just a sampling of other invasive species in the United States. Maybe you know about nutria, maybe you don't. They were introduced for their fur. They've taken over. Almost 60 years ago, they were well established in Louisiana. I remember going down on a vacation and seeing a whole bunch of them that had been hunted. Variety of things that you might think, gosh, they're a native species. Well, they aren't. Starlings. If you remember Mendel, Mendel was the parakeet that I had. Mendel sadly died about a year ago. We'd had him for many, many years, about 15 years. And we think the best explanation is Mendel died from a bee sting or a wasp sting. In any case, it's all sad. These are all other introduced species. Dandelions. And now we know about the jumping carp. You don't have to go very far. Make your way down to Alton or Grafton and go out in a boat. And for some reason, revving the engines actually causes these things to jump. And so here's somebody that I think is probably commercially catching them. So again, I want to keep banging home the point. What is the point about invasive species? And this is the point. And I'm hoping that you're just reading off the screen. Now, other aspects of biogeography as evidence for evolution. Moving on. And that is, what do we see with islands? And Charles Darwin, as you can see, noticed some very interesting characteristics about islands. So let's go through some of these points. We notice a number of characteristics about organisms that live on islands, and that's what we want to talk about. Endemic species are species found nowhere else in the world. Islands tend to have lots of endemic species. Madagascar alone, which you guys probably know because of the Disney movies, or I don't know if it was Disney, from Madagascar has more than 8,000 endemic species. Hawaii just as well. And now in blue text here is really the interesting point. So you have to ask yourself, why do you think that's true? The more isolated the island, the higher the percentage of endemic species. So if an island was right next to a continent, only maybe 5 miles away, we would predict that it does not have many endemic species. So what does distance have to do with all of this? And we think distance means it's unlikely that organisms from the mainland or from the island will make it to the other place. Furthermore, depends on what kind of critters we're talking about. Birds are able to fly across distances of hundreds of miles, thousands of miles in some cases. But amphibians cannot. Amphibians, when it's an ocean environment, a marine environment, they can't bridge that kind of gap. This is my point right here about amphibians. Yes, then people bring amphibians on, and so we now have an amphibian at the Charles Darwin Research Center. Now to a point that Charles Darwin really thought a lot about and what he noticed, and that was that when he went to the Galapagos, it looked to him like these were versions of things that he had known were in South America. Now that's really, really important. That what he saw on the Galapagos Islands were clearly different species, but seemed to be related to things that were on the mainland. And that must have been very powerful for Charles Darwin. He could see real evidence of, well, what happens if you take some critters from South America and you isolate them for a very, very long period of time? And so you get these different species. Here we did an experiment that is not the least bit surprising. We looked at the genetics of some South American tortoises and found out that it's very closely related to the giant tortoises on the Galapagos. Here's that citation from 1999 looking at the genetics of those two different groups, South America, the littler ones, and the giant ones from the Galapagos. Genetic drift, so the movement of continents, brings us to point 3. We're going to take a look at how continental drift might lead to speciation as well. So what you're thinking about is thinking about times when these plates were clustered together and then they broke apart. And once they break apart, they become, in some ways, like islands. Okay? And so when they break apart, a continuous range of a species gets broken up, begins to separate. So imagine you take the continental United States and you bust it up into 4 quadrants and separate it by, I don't know, 1,000 miles of ocean. Well, then suddenly what was a continuous range of something, raccoons, for example, beavers, they would now start forming different species. So we're going to see 2 very, very clear examples. We're going to look at something called ratites, which are the ground birds. And that, again, is one of the interesting parts of me going to New Zealand because it includes kiwis. And the second is lungfish. that are in the very southern regions. So you can see South America, Africa, and Australia. There are no lungfish that are in New Zealand. So here's the point, and you don't want to miss it. Evolution helps us to understand the geographic distribution of species because we think what happened was the continents were together, they drifted apart, and oceans kept them separate. So I want to remind you about plate tectonics. We had looked at plate tectonics before, talked about things breaking up. You might remember that we talked about the Great Inland Sea in North America. Okay, when we had a big ocean that was separating out pretty much here where we live in Illinois versus Colorado. And so here you can see this timeline, which is a figure in your book, showing us some of the great breakups. Here's Pangaea. I talked about this a little bit when I was doing my New Zealand talk. Here's Pangaea breaking up into Laurasia and Gondwana. And you can see a bit of the Indian plate over here. It's going to crush over here into Asia and create the Himalaya mountains. Here you can see how South America is nestled into Africa. Here's North America, and that's where I'm pointing. I think you can see the pointer near Laurasia, the L in Laurasia. That's pretty much where we are today. So these breakups then prevent once continuous populations from sharing genetics. And that means once broken up, once a mutation arises, or many mutations arise, those mutations are no longer shared because there's not reproduction with what used to be part of your species. And so as these mutations arise and are not shared, new species start to arise. So let's take a look at what's going on with ratite evolution. Here's the Gondwana assemblage. Here's some of that variety. And here's what we think is the breakup. This is one hypothesis. There's been some other thinking. But back at about 180 million years ago, we have the breakup. The breakup, remember, is in clusters. So we had South America here and Africa together. And so this was the period of time when South America and Africa were together and would have shared some of those genetic mutations. And then over here, here's where you can see Antarctica, Australia, Madagascar, India are all clustered. And then the Africa-South America breaks apart about 160 million years ago. Later on, about 130 million years ago, we start seeing the breakup of these large land masses. Here's another way of representing that, which we see some of the diversity. So I'll go around. In Australia, you wind up with emus. Maybe you thought somehow you're going to see ostriches in Australia, but you see ostriches in Africa. Here's cassowary that you'll find in New Guinea, a big ground bird. This is what we have in South America, rheas. And of course, little kiwis that I was talking about in New Zealand. So you have birds, and there are others that are part of this assemblage. So you have all of these ground birds that are doing much the same, flightless, long-legged ground birds, except for poor little kiwis, which just look like they're missing a part if you look at this in any case. Very, very large ground birds that we think share this common Gondwana ancestry and then the breakup that caused the speciation. The same sort of thing we think happened with the breakups of our continents. That was a door shutting. We have our lovely windows open, and now it's slamming some doors. In any case, the same sort of thing we think happened with lungfish. And so if you take a look, all the lungfish were clustered together. And now, today, well, we've got Australian lungfish, South American lungfish, and African lungfish. So we think it was, at one time, all clustered together. Here's another weird way of looking at the breakup of the continents and the movement of these plates. Taking a look at where we see some of the largest coal deposits. And where do we see some of the largest coal deposits on Earth? In the United States, and then in the north over here, in Europe, Northern Europe, and also in China. And then we have declining numbers, but some in India, as you can see. We think that these were regions, these plates, these continents, were closer to the equator. And so that represents a shift of different climates that's going on. Another way of understanding plate tectonics and those kinds of shifts in climates is that we were discovering and have discovered dinosaur bones in Alaska. Now, I don't think any biologist is going to argue that dinosaurs were well enough insulated and possibly endotherms, so producing their own heat, that they were able to actually survive in the kind of environment that Alaska is today. I had a chance to go down to Texas on my sabbatical in the fall of 2010, so about 10 years ago, and I got to see these bones, which was really fun to see dinosaur bones collected in Alaska. But we don't think the climate was like it is today. Another point about biogeography is the concept of adaptive radiations. And so adaptive radiations sometimes has been a little problematic for some students in evolution. So I want to make sure this picture, the way I've drawn this diagram, should be helpful for you. It's really the diagrammatic representation of a concept. So here's the point. You wind up in a situation that leads to adaptive radiations with a founding group that somehow makes their way into a place or a situation where then there can be tremendous diversity generated. So, lots of examples, but just to help you out. Finches making their way to the Galapagos and now having many different kinds of finch species as they take on these different ecological roles. That's one really, really good example. I want to look at some other examples here and go through this, but that's what we're talking about. Talking about having kind of a founding group that makes their way to a place that's just, oh my gosh, this is great. And so then the group takes off and speciates into different ecological roles. So here's the very definition from your own textbook in the glossary. And here is the example. No, I'm not sure if this is from your book. Here it says Encyclopedia Britannica. But nonetheless, I think your textbook has a figure that's very similar to this, showing you again the kind of speciation, the differentiation, the different roles of these finches in the Galapagos. Here's another kind of fun example. This was a figure that used to be, I think, in the Campbell book, and I don't think it is anymore. There was a plant called a tarweed that made its way, and I think that this is more the ancestral tarweed right up here, made its way to Hawaii, and then started spreading and becoming specialized. And oh my goodness, over here was something that looks like a tree, and over here was something that looks like a cactus. Here, little versions that are making their way, and you can see it's all the same, well, mostly it's the same genus with different species. Over here, we even have a different genus that they've said it's so different. So that's an adaptive radiation. They bring a single plant onto these islands, and we get a variety of new species. Here again now is just an adaptive radiation of a very large group. And that is, what do we see going on in the case of marsupials? So here's a cladogram taking a look at the evolution of mammals. It's a cladogram associated with actual time, and then follow the track that leads to marsupials. And that marsupial lineage is largely restricted to Australia, but it actually happened at a time when Australia was very close to the tip of South America. And so there's I don't actually know the literature that well of what the current thinking is, but marsupials may have actually originated in South America and then spread to Australia. That, if you think about it, that's the possum that we have in our backyards today. And so here's a figure from a 2010 paper that's making that case, that in fact It was really in the South American continent that we see the origination of early marsupials, and then they spread to Australia, and we get lots of different things here in Australia. Here's another look at that. I'll give you some time to read the side. And so the point really about this paper, published in 2004, was that most of the adaptive radiation occurred after the extinction of the non-avian dinosaurs. Now, I would like you to think about why that would be. Why is it that really marsupials went crazy, and we got all kinds of marsupials only after the death of most of the dinosaurs, not the birds survived? And I hope as you think that through, you're realizing, well, there were probably an awful lot of ecological niches, which is a way to make a living, that were opened up by the death of all sorts of dinosaurs. So there were now a lot of ways to make a living that used to be something that a dinosaur did, but now it's being done instead by a marsupial. So here's some more adaptive radiations that we haven't talked about yet. So here we talked about 1 through 3, Darwin's finches, the tarweed on Hawaii, and marsupials. Another major adaptive radiation, and I don't talk about plants that much for the natural reason that I'm a zoologist, but certainly there's some really basic kinds of things that should be included here, and that is, as plants made their way onto land, then, oh my goodness, look at all the ways that you can make a living on land. And so here are some of the earlier plants, bryophytes that Dr. Bray studies, and of course the ferns, and then the conifers, and then you wind up with flowering plants, large trees. So now, thinking this through, without the perspective of evolutionary biology, understanding the uneven distribution of life on Earth would be a problem. But what we're saying is life evolves in places, it spreads, it interacts. That's what we see. Number 2, we said already species are not found wherever they can survive, and the evidence for this is invasive species. They show us that species instead seem to originate in some spots and spread, and once they can make it past a barrier, they may do very well in a new environment. So what we've known is over time, throughout the history of life, species have lived in many other places. For example, in North America, we used to have some very, very large animals here. You know about the skull of the saber-toothed cat that I have in the display case of the Zoolab. So we had something that was almost lion-sized. We had, of course, mammoths and mastodons roaming. There were North American rhinos, I think. So there were lots of very, very large animals that aren't making it here anymore. When you look at all these points above, it leads you to this conclusion. Evolutionary biology. The best explanation is what we've been talking about. And that's why this is under the category of evidence of evolution. But there's another category yet to come. And now I want you to go back and think about what we said when we were looking at the evidence of evolution briefly, as we did in zoology. We went through all sorts of lines of evidence. And then at the very end I said, and then comes along molecular biology. And molecular biology, used here to understand evolution, is a fairly young science. It's about 50 years old or so, where people have come in and tested the ideas of evolutionary relationships. And they've said, okay, well, so all these other things point, for example, that the birds on the Galapagos, the finches, are all related. Yeah, their anatomy looks that way. There's an explanation that some finches came over from Ecuador region of South America, made their way to the Galapagos, and then speciated. But has anybody done a test of the genetics and looked to see whether or not, in fact, the genetic code also supports that hypothesis? So here's the points that I'm saying. All the things that we looked at all strongly supported an evolutionary explanation. They all said, yeah, mostly what we're seeing in paleontology, mostly what we're seeing in comparative and embryology and biogeography are best explained if you understand that life evolves. And then came along molecular biology. And we can test these relationships. And it provided an overwhelming confirmation that life has evolved. And the bottom line is, once molecular biology came along, there really was no reasonable doubt that life on Earth has evolved over a very long period of time. Now go back to the exercise that we did in zoology. Imagine that you're on a jury for someone who's accused of holding up a Casey's General Store or someplace, and you think about all the different lines of evidence that you might come up. Okay, so John's on trial. The evidence indicates from lots of different lines of evidence that John's guilty. It might be fingerprints, it might be blood left at the scene, it might be photographs or videotape. It could be his license plates. And then you're on the jury, and they say, and then we tested the blood that was found on the scene, and there was evidence that whoever held up the store was bleeding, and we tested the DNA against John. I think you want to know, was it a match? Because everything else points to John. And then when it comes in as a match, are you going to have any trouble convicting John for the crime? And I think most of us would. And that's what we're saying. That most of the evidence of evolution prior to molecular biology was like the left side of the screen right now. The different kinds of lines of evidence that point to John committing the crime. And then you add in to the right side the molecular biology, the DNA, and it just is strongly conclusive. Okay. So here are the 8 lines of evidence of evolution just from molecular biology. This is what we did in zoology. We looked at the shared DNA, the shared use of DNA, that's central dogma, the common use of 20 amino acids to make proteins, the way we store DNA with histones, these master control genes that are conserved, that are very similar between a fly and a mouse. Now, beyond genetics, the fact that ATP is the common currency, that's the energy carrying molecule. We said glycolysis is a very, very old process. Glycolysis does not require oxygen, doesn't produce a lot of ATP, and yet it's a fundamental process that we find in life. And then, for parts of this slide right here, there are animal models. So we use rats all the time as an experimental model for things like heart disease. We study the skin of pigs so that we can better understand our skin. And at the top right, you might remember a study that said that they found a gene that was associated with obesity. This concludes then the evidence of evolution. Actually, the next slide has the wrong date on it, so let's not look at that date, but this is the end of that exam information. Now, what's going to follow is a chance to work this through. On the test, you will be asked to think through some of the situations we're about to practice and see if you can recognize what type of evidence. So I'll give you a situation, a description, and you have to figure out what type of evidence. We're going to practice this in just a minute. The second type of question for evidence of evolution is for you to provide excellent examples. So, for example, with what we just finished, I might say, describe your best example of an adaptive radiation. So not just defining what an adaptive radiation is, but give me an example. And boy, oh boy, folks, this is what I've been saying all along. Pick excellent examples, be able to thoroughly explain the examples that we have gone through in class. I don't want you to come up with your own. To be safe, simply use the examples we had in class, but know them well. So to do a poor job of giving an example will result in a poor score for that question. You need to be able to do excellent examples of these different lines of evidence. So then I promised you a chance at practice, and if any of you have looked at this deck of PowerPoint slides already, you'll know that I have a whole series of explanations or descriptions, and you're to figure out what are these examples of. Most of them are a really good example of one or two of the points listed above. So at the very, very top, this is sort of like a really big multiple choice. At the top where it says analogy and homology, all those bulleted options, and there are 8 of them there. When I do a description like this, it's meant to be an example, a good example of maybe 1 or 2 of the points above. You could see and interpret some of these and really work at it and find them also to be examples of other things. Okay. So what I want to do is help you through number 1 right now. And then what I want you to do is on your own, take a look at, we're having a weather alert right now. Let's see if I can stop that because there's big storms coming through. Anyway, what I'd like you to do is work through all of these examples on your own. I'd like you to check with your friends, and then we can either chat about this in Facebook, or you could email me what your thinking is, or you can just kind of work it out on your own, whatever you want to do. This is one of those things where if you wait to do this the night or 2 before the test, I will probably not be able to get back with all of you at the time that you'd like. So these are things that I would be working through long before our test. So biologists studying, got the alarm stopped. I hope it's not a tornado. Biologists studying the development of bird feathers in embryonic chicks discovered that feathers develop like scales. So similar to those on the legs of adult chickens. I don't know if you've seen adult chickens, but they're scaly on their legs. So when we think of the development of bird feathers and the development of scales on a reptile, a typical reptile like a lizard, because birds are reptiles, which of the words up above do you think best matches this? So the fact that bird feathers develop like scales do, in fact, on a chicken, for goodness sakes, in the same animal, we see this. And I hope you've made the case for homology. Okay? Common developmental origin, homologous. You start out with a common thing, and then it varies from that. So that's homologous. Right? All right. What I'd like you to do is work through these other ones. I think it's a lot of practice. We'll figure out what's going to be the best way for you folks to sort of test your ideas on these. Okay? So I'm going to end here. You'll have other examples, so you can see. Here's, I mean, you got the slides, so you can go through this on your own. What have I got listed here? Just looking, 10, 12, goodness gracious. Done a lot here for you. Wow. I think that's 18 is going to be it. Okay, well, I hope this all worked for you, and we'll see. My thinking is that for the next lecture exam, I really, this is a particular case, the next lecture exam, where I follow very closely the textbook, and so I don't think I'm going to need to do this kind of narration for you. We'll see how things go. I'm always interested in your feedback. Take care.